think we're all on board, ready to get going for the first of our 5 ExcelerSize exercises here, trainings here. I wanted to start by reminding you guys that I'm recording this. So please, when you're asking questions, keep your questions generic, and let's try to not get into anything that would be proprietary. So don't get into the specifics of any projects you guys may have going underway, but keep it generic. So let me jump into here. Okay, so to start with an overview, common sizing catalogs. We've got the Agile catalog, which is also a lot of times is called sizing in terms of story points, although the story points are a subset of that catalog. And so obviously you would use this one if you're working on an Agile project and you prefer to use that approach. Then we have if-pug function points with the feature point extensions and with the snap extensions. And this would primarily be used by an if-pug trained and certified shop that really wanted to have a standardized methodology for counting function points and was willing to go through that cost and effort. Then we have the UML catalog, which is primarily useful, in my experience, when you're using a use case design approach and that use case design is either complete or almost complete. So if somebody comes to you and they've already got a complete set of use cases all drawn out and they're have a good amount of detail, you may be able to use that as your sizing input, just right out of the design spec. Source lines of code, where we're estimating in terms of the actual written code. This is primarily useful for legacy work. So you're trying to understand the size of a big COBOL application or a big application written in Natural, something like that. It's also useful for small embedded projects. So you're writing some code that's going to go onto a handheld barcode reader or into a wristwatch or a phone, or perhaps some of the low-level stuff that might be running to handle some drivers that are specialized for ATMs or something like that. Interactive voice response, we would use this if we're doing for the voice response components of a project. So we're programming up the call tree and how users are going to interact with the system over the telephone. And then finally, we have ExcelerSize, which is the primary focus of these 5 modules. And ExcelerSize has a couple of big advantages. One, that it has very broad applicability. So it's useful for a wide range of projects. And then the second is that it is useful because it does a lot of work and has a lot of components that are kind of focused on business value added or business focused deliverables. You can use it for early stage sizing. So prior to even having very much at all design work done, you're able to use ExcelerSize. If we look at the types of things that are within these sizing catalogs, so Agile, we're looking in terms of product suites, products, features, epics, and then stories. And the stories is the lowest piece, and that's where you get the story points idea of estimation that you'll often hear referred to when you're talking about Agile. With if-pug, the primary things that you're looking at are external inquiries, external outputs, external inputs, external outputs, external queries, internal logical files, and external interface files. So in if-pug, they call those the EIs, EOs, EQs, ILFs, and EIFs. And then the snap extensions are just a set of additional variables, and the feature point extension is just to add algorithms. Then for UML, you're estimating in terms of, I'd mentioned use cases, and that's probably the thing that you're going to most have given to you is a set of use cases. You can also put in there at the same time the actors, which will be identified within the use cases. And then if you're doing kind of an object-oriented estimate, where somebody gives you an object-oriented design, you can use the classes, and class and object are synonymous. So you can use the classes and then broken down by class type. So control classes, interface classes, and other classes. And then we supplement that with tables, which are the tables in the database, obviously, and methods, which are the basically the functional capabilities that are built into the classes. Then for interactive voice response, we've got admin screens, call initiation, call tree options, interfaces into the IVR system, reports, security profiles, tables, and voice messages. So that just gives you a flavor for what those other four are. At the bottom, I talk about the fact that source lines of code is simply the number of lines of code broken down by language. And when we count them, we exclude comments and we exclude blank lines. And normally, instead of talking about the number of lines of code, we talk about the number of 1,000 lines of code, or case lock. And then the areas to the right are all of the ExcelerSize catalog components. Those are the things that we're going to be talking about in quite a bit of detail over the next 5 lessons. So ExcelerSize components, just because there's a lot of them, are grouped, and they're grouped into the following general categories. We have business application, which are the forms and the reports and so on. So these are things that provide business functionality, and when we think about a business application, they're the components that normally go into that business application. Then we have data conversion, which are specific to estimating the work required to convert the data and load it into the new system. We have data warehouse components, which are specific to estimating the data warehouse components of the system if there is a data warehouse. Then we have project level components. So these are higher level, broader things that would sit above individual delivered bits of functionality. And then finally, we have things that are more support in nature. So things like defect repairs and uplifts, patch installations, and so on. Each of the ExcelerSize catalog entries that you're going to make when you're doing your sizing is going to be further modified by some variables. And so the variables that affect the size are quantity, area, complexity, work, and uncertainty. And so we've actually got a module where we're going to go over those in more detail and kind of explain those in more detail. So in the remainder of this module, what I'm going to cover is the ExcelerSize business application sizing components. In future modules, I'm going to cover data conversion, data warehouse, the project level and support, and the modifiers, so quantity, area, complexity, work, and uncertainty. As we go through this, feel free to jump in with questions. I'm going to give you some student exercises that we're going to work through together at the end of each of the lecture series, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. And I've tried to set it up so that there's going to be plenty of time for you guys to be able to ask questions and get information that way as well. So the ExcelerSize business application sizing, and by the way, I'll email you guys a copy of these PowerPoint slides at the end of each presentation. So the following high-level object catalog elements are used to support sizing of a business application. We have batch, business requirement, extension, form inbound, form outbound, interface, page, report, service, table, workflow. And I'm going to take those one by one and describe them each in more detail. Batch processes are processes that accept input, they do some kind of calculations or some manipulation of the data, and then they generate an output. So any business requirement that you see that involves input, some kind of processing and output with no human interaction may be represented as a batch program in terms of sizing. So it's a fairly broad sizing category. Interfaces are different from batches. They're similar, but interfaces are different from batches in that the format of the input or of the output is relied on by an external system or an external group. So with a normal batch, the people who are designing the batch have pretty much control over how they format the inputs and outputs to meet their needs, whereas with an interface, you may not have that control. Business requirements are specific business needs that will involve implementation work, so we know that there's work going to be required, but where we have to do additional analysis in order to map that work to other sizing elements. So we don't know at this point in time if it's going to be a batch or an interface or a report. So it's more high level. Or where there are no existing sizing elements where the mapping will work. So there's a business requirement, it's going to require some coding, but when we look at the other ExcelerSize sizing components, none of them seem like a good fit. So in that case, we would use business requirement. You normally can't use the business analyst generated requirements. So business analysts will normally have done work and have a list of requirements that the application is supposed to meet at some point in time. And generally speaking, you cannot just count those requirements up and say that's how many business requirements you have. Because the business analyst generated business requirements will not have a direct correlation with the work that needs to be performed by the development team. So if you're looking at the business requirements coming from the business analyst, you're going to need to do things like consolidate requirements. So they might have listed out 7 or 8 different requirements, but from an implementation perspective, they're all one business requirement. Or occasionally, they might have a business requirement that's very broad in scope, and so you need to split that out into 2 or 3 or 4 or some other number of expanded business requirements because it's not going to be implemented all at once. They were just very broad in their definition of what the requirement was. On the other hand, if you have business requirements that are prepared either by the technical team or with consultation from the technical team, you may be able to use those directly. It's not uncommon for you to be able to take the technical requirements and just kind of count them up. And if they're, depending on what level they're written to, they may be usable as an approximation of the effort required by identifying how many business requirements there are. Extensions are coded add-on functionality that is added to an existing application, normally a commercial off-the-shelf or COTS application. These are normally used, extensions are normally used in situations where we're working with a COTS application, for example, an ERP like SAP or something like that provides a built-in facility for calls to external custom-built application components. So it may have specific places built into the application where you can add in external functionality that would do a calculation or that will do some data manipulation or something else. Forms are predefined documents, normally in PDF, with mappings between the form fields and the data that's stored in the database. So inbound forms would take input data into the database. So it reads data off of the form, normally through optical scanning or something like that, and then puts the data into the database. There's normally work that has to be done to do something called form connectors, which are how the forms are connected to fields within the database. The way you can tell you're working with a form as opposed to a report is that generally there's going to be a hard copy format for the form that's already in place. So this might be a government approved form, it might be a standard company form. It will, not always, but most of the time it will have a form identifier in the footer or in the header. So it'll say like form SF30, something like that. And so this is used for configuration controls of the forms. So when you have a situation where you're interacting with, I don't know, maybe you're interacting with the court system or you're interacting with some kind of legal set of forms, then those would be properly considered forms. They've got a lot of predefined formatting that has to go in there, a lot of predefined text that has to go in there, and then there's specific places where data gets fed onto the form.
Like medical forms, yeah.
Yeah, medical forms would be another perfect example. Exactly right. Outbound forms are pretty much the same as inbound forms, only instead of reading data off of the form, we're going to put data onto the form from within the database. So once again, generally the hard copy format for the form is predefined by someone else. Interfaces are connections to external applications for sending or receiving data. Connections where this project controls both ends of the connection are normally better classified as a batch. So one of the reasons that interfaces are more work than batches is because you have to coordinate with someone else. If you control both ends of the communication, then you don't need to coordinate with someone else because it's all within the project. If the data that is passed is relatively simple and real time, it might be better categorized as a service. So services and interfaces are really very similar, except that interfaces, you normally have more complex data, and it's normally not real time. It could be close to real time, but it's normally not real time. Whereas a service is normally real time. Another distinction between interfaces and services, because I'm going to talk about services in a bit, is that with services, you generally don't know in advance who's going to use the service. While with interfaces, you generally know who the interface partners are. If we look at the direction of flow for business information as opposed to control flow, we want to look at the direction of the flow for business information and not look at it in terms of control flow. So if it's a bidirectional interface, then we would count it as two interfaces. So let me clarify that just a little bit. If we have a situation where business information is flowing in both directions, then it's a bidirectional interface, and then that would count as two interfaces. However, if business information is flowing in only one direction, then it's one interface. And this is true, it would be one interface, even if control information is going both directions. So let's say that I'm requesting information from an external system. So it's from me to them, but it's control information. They send me business data. So that's the one direction. And then I'm sending back an error code or an acknowledgement or something. That's control information. So what we want to look at is the direction of the business flow of information, and we want to ignore the control flow of information. Pages are computer screens that are used to display data or capture user input. So in ExcelerSize, the work associated with retrieving, manipulating, and storing the data for the page is all included as part of the page object. So it's not just the design of the user interface page that we are including when we say we have 3 pages. We're including all of the back-end logic, all the back-end care and feeding of those pages to make them operational and functional. You should ignore pages that are provided as part of some other sizing component. For example, if you have included a commercial off-the-shelf software application as one of your sizing components, then the pages that are already built into that application would not need to be counted here normally. But new pages that were added would be counted. Treatment of automatically generated pages requires that you kind of analyze where the real work is going to be. Then use an appropriate sizing component to capture that work. So in that kind of a situation, you can't just blindly count pages. So for example, if we have a situation where someone is going to enter data onto a page, and then based on that data that's entered onto the page, some PHP code is going to go off, parse the data, and then generate a bunch of pages that get output to a website. Well, if you look at all the combinations of data that could go out there, there might be 1,000 pages that could potentially be generated from that process. However, we don't want to say, well, we've got 1,000 pages then, because it's the code that's generating those pages. It's not a human person. And so there's really no work associated with those 1,000 generated pages. Instead, we want to look at how complicated is it to write that program that turns the operator input into the generated PHP code. So what we may have in that situation is one page for the input data plus one batch program for the PHP generator. Reports are data outputs from the system. At ExcelerSize, the work associated with retrieving, manipulating, and formatting the data for output is all included as part of the report object. So it's not just the physical output, but it includes once again, the care and feeding of that report. You should ignore reports that are provided as part of some other sizing component. Just like with pages, if we've already included a commercial off-the-shelf software application, and it's got a bunch of reports as part of that sizing that we've already included, then we can ignore them here. But new reports that were added would be counted. Reports may be output in hard copy. They may be output to the screen. They may be output as an email attachment in PDF or something, or in some other manner completely. If there are multiple output possibilities, depending on how that works, this may be one report or it may be multiple reports. And it's based on whether each different output format involves additional work. So there may be situations where each format is completely different, in which case there are different reports or more likely one report and then some modified versions of that report. Or it may be a situation where it's one report and then a test-only report for each of the other versions, because we have to test to make sure that each version works correctly. Or it may be a situation where all of this is handled for us automatically, and we don't really feel the need to test every possible combination, and therefore it is just one report, and the output format is something that's handled for us by the libraries that we're working with, and we can ignore it. Services are published computer process-to-process business capabilities that have defined inputs, processing, and outputs. So examples of these are remote procedure calls, SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, or CORBA. A service-oriented architecture involves building an application by first defining the required services, then building those services, and then constructing the application using those services. So if you ever hear the term SOA, that's what they're talking about. Services are also used for device communication. So for example, ATMs or magnetic stripe readers. And when capturing the functionality of a vendor application program interface. So if a vendor provides a library of functions, each one of those functions may be considered as a service. So they're basically computer capabilities that are then exposed to the world, or at least to other applications, and made available to do something as a service to that other application. Tables refers to tables in a database. We do not count table-related work that is associated with another sizing object. So if we've got pages and reports, for example, and those pages and reports will be putting data into or pulling data out of tables, we can ignore those tables because the work associated with building or modifying those tables is already included as part of the page or report object. This means that for most most estimates, you can ignore tables. For most estimates, you will not have a count of tables as part of your high-level object catalog set. There are situations, however, where the work involved in doing the table may be separated out and you may need to estimate that separately, which is why they're here. When you are working with tables, we assume a third normal form relational database table. So third normal form basically means that it's structured to avoid repeating data. So if we have a standard relational database design, and we wanted to, for example, count the tables, we would just count the number of physical tables that were in that design that stored business data. However, there are situations where this won't be the case. For example, maybe we're working with a database that's not relational. So maybe we're working with natural, for example, which is a hierarchical database rather than a relational database. Or maybe we're working with COBOL and ISAM and so on, and so we don't really have tables at all. So in that situation, you have to kind of mentally look at what would be the equivalent table structure in a third normal form relational database, which basically means how many logical clusters of business data are there, and then that would be the count of the tables. We do not count code tables because they don't include, they don't store any kind of dynamic data. All the data in a code table is static. Code table or lookup tables are static or relatively static, and they don't really contain business information, so we don't count them. We don't count views. Views are, I want to say temporary, but they're not necessarily temporary. But they're additional perspectives of, they're additional types of ways of looking at the data that's contained underneath it to improve efficiency or simplify reporting. And so they're there purely for the convenience of people who are writing reports or who are doing data access, and they don't contain any unique business data in and of themselves. So for that reason, we do not count views. We only count business data tables. So we only count tables that contain business data within them. Workflows are business rules for step-by-step process or document flow. The workflow and the document would be separately counted. So if we have a workflow that operates on a document, we would have a high-level object for that document type, and we would have a high-level object for that workflow. Another example of workflows would be batch control jobs. So let's say that we had 100 batches, and then we had 30 or 40 job control language or JCL scripts, basically, that control the flow of those batch programs. Each one of those job control scripts would be considered a workflow. All right, so well, actually, before we do this, before I jump into that, are there any questions up to this point before we jump into the student exercises?
No questions, but that JCL counting it as a workflow, that was helpful.
Good, glad to hear that. Okay, so student exercise number 1. Project 1 is a business requirement to implement a new risk rating capability for the consumer credit application. What sizing component would you use? Oh, and do you guys each have a piece of paper and a pen handy?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'd like to ask is, as we work through the exercises, if you guys would each write down your answer, and then I'll have one of you do it, and then we'll talk about different options that people came up with. So project 1 is a business requirement to implement a new risk rating capability for the consumer credit application. What sizing component or components would you use? Okay, so write down your answers. And then let's hear does somebody have a response? Michelle, do you have something?
I'm thinking business requirement.
Okay. Does anybody have anything different from a business requirement? The answer is one business requirement. Ding, 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 ding. You don't know how the capability will be implemented yet. And so this is really the only thing that you have to work with. as it is a business requirement. Student exercise 2. Project 2 involves minor regression testing, 10 reports. What sizing components would you use? Write down your answer. John, what'd you get?
Reports.
10 reports. The key here is to understand that the work to be performed does not impact on the selection or quantity of sizing objects. So the fact that we're only doing minor regression testing is not relevant when we're deciding on the high-level object or on the quantity. Project 3 involves adding the ability for our application to request consumer credit ratings from an external application. What sizing components would you use? Everybody write down your answer. Shannon, what'd you come up with?
Interface.
One interface. And note that it's not bidirectional because there's no business data flows from us to them. So even though we may be sending off a request to them, asking for this information and telling them the particular social security number or whatever that we're interested in, that's not really, they're not going to actually store that data anywhere. It's just going to be used as part of the control flow. Project 4 involves adding 4 pages and 3 new reports to the application, plus 3 new tables that will be required to support those pages and reports. What sizing components would you use? Everyone write down your answers. And when you write down your answers, include quantity.
Figure that out.
Yep. And Gail, what have you got?
I have 4 pages and 3 reports. I debated about the table.
Oh, well, very good. You've been paying attention. 4 pages and 3 reports, no tables, because they are all related to the other sizing components, and so we don't want to double count them. Good. Good job. Project 5 involves deploying 100 new state-mandated forms. 25 of those will be tailored to BB&T. 25 will be tested, but without any changes. And 50 will be deployed without any testing or changes. What sizing components would you use? About 5 more seconds. Shannon, what'd you come up with?
I would say 25 forms. 25 business requirement.
If you do that, you're going to get an estimate way too high. What we're looking at here is 50 forms. We have 25 that are new. We have 25 that are test only. And then we have 50 that are deployed without any testing or any work at all, so they do not contribute to the overall effort. So from an estimation perspective, we can ignore the 50. But for the other 50 forms, we have 25 and 25. And we'll see in Module 5 how we allow for the fact that some of those are test only and some of those are actual development work. That's where we get into some of those things like the work type.
And I think that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. Exercise 6. Project 6 involves modifying SAP to take sales data from our branch point of sale system and also modifying the way SAP computes taxes on deposit ticket purchases. What sizing components would you use? Everyone write down your answer. All right, Michelle, what'd you come up with?
Not sure, but I have one service and one workflow.
Okay, so I would consider this to be one interface, one way, because what we want to do is we want to take sales data from the branch point of sale system, which presumably has some kind of a output type thing. It's possible that that could be a service if the data itself was very simple, and if it was quasi real time. Because remember, one of the characteristics of a service is that the data is simple in form and it's real time. So if what we were looking at was maybe the point of sale system was just sending over each transaction, perhaps, in a real time basis, and relying on us internally to do all the work over at SAP level, that would be a service. On the other hand, if what they're doing is they're sending, they've got a record structure that they're sending, and that's coming over once a day or once an hour, that would be not real time. That would be more complicated in terms of its structure, so that would be better characterized as an interface. And then the SAP is going to have extensions. That one of the areas where SAP is going to have extension capabilities is with how taxes are computed, because everywhere that SAP is installed, the tax rules are going to be different. And so it's going to have built-in capabilities to call out to an external routine to tell it how to do some weird tax calculation. So in that case, what we would do is we would be using that capability of SAP to add an extension to do a specialized tax calculation. Student exercise 7 involves rewriting 30 COBOL batch programs at 10 production jobs. What sizing component would you use? Write down your answer. Now, you know I've got...
Oh, shoot.
Sorry about that. Darn it.
I actually had that one.
I figured you did, John. In fact, I was going to call on you. What? Tell us what you got again.
30 COBOL programs and 10 workflows.
Exactly right. Exactly correct.
Well, I wouldn't have known that had you not said that about the JCL earlier.
Yeah, yeah. So Project 8 involves testing a vendor-provided application programming interface that consists of 50 callable functions. What sizing component would you use?
Would it?
What?
Would it be service?
Oh, I'm going to call on Gail for this one. Gail, what have you got?
Just looking over my notes, you said something about the off the shelf, and now I don't see it.
Okay, John, what have you got?
Services?
Exactly right. If we're dealing with, remember that callable functions or application program interfaces, that kind of thing, are often best characterized as a service because they're well-defined pieces of processing that are called and that respond basically in real time. So if I'm going to call out a function and then it's going to do something for me and then come back to me, and meanwhile I'm waiting while it does that, that's kind of the definition of real time. It's almost the definition of real time. So, and that's basically the way application program interfaces work. I get to a point in my code, I call on this function to do something, maybe to trigger an alert on an ATM or to read a cash balance on something or whatever. I wait until I get a response back, and then I go ahead. So that's exactly what a service would be. Project 9 involves sending 3 new types of email alerts to customers. What sizing component would you use? Michelle, what'd you come up with?
I said 3 reports.
Exactly right. 3 reports. Alerts are a good example of something that's just another format of a report. It's a little formatted block of information with some data in it. So a report is a very good use for alerts. Project 10 consists of writing the code to implement 15 use case scenarios. What sizing component would you use? Shannon, what'd you come up with?
I'm looking, and the only thing that makes sense to me is a workflow. 10 workflows.
Okay.
Or 15.
And this one's in here exactly for that reason. This one's in here so that you remember to never make your life harder than it needs to be. Because the actual answer is to use 15 use cases. So if somebody gives you use cases, use the UML catalog and do the estimate in terms of use cases.
This is a trick question.
It's a trick question. But it's an important thing, because if somebody came to you and said, well, we want you to estimate this, and we've got 1,400 stories. Well, why would you want to do all the work to understand those stories and to turn them into things like reports and pages and so on, when they've already told you they've got this many stories? So use the Agile. If somebody's got use cases, then use the use cases. If somebody comes to you and they say, I want to write 1,000 lines of COBOL to do blah, blah, blah. Well, if they told you it's 1,000 lines of COBOL, and if you have confidence that that's the right number, well, then use source lines of code. So in other words, if there's information that's available to you from one of the other catalogs, don't be afraid to use it. All right, questions?
This is very helpful.
Good.
Yeah, it's going to be very helpful to have these slides too. When we have questions, we can refer back to this stuff.
Yeah, I'll forward them off. I debated sending them to you ahead of time, but I decided I'd rather send them afterwards because it keeps the element of surprise with the problems and the questions and so on. So what I'll do is, though, as soon as I'm done here, I'll email them off to everybody.
I actually printed out a couple of pages from your user manual that talks about each of these, and I've referred to that a lot. I just keep it like handy in my desk drawer.
Good, good.
Yeah, Shannon didn't have the benefit of having you on site.
Yeah, you and Michelle have learned some of this stuff the hard way by us, beating each other about the head when we're doing live estimates.
Yeah.
Gail, did it make sense to you?
It does. I've certainly been diving right in on the estimates that we've been doing in our group here, so this has been very helpful.
Okay, good.
So the other trainings will have the same kind of format. I like this format.
Yeah, I'm going to have exactly the same format. So, yeah, what we'll do is we go through, I talk about it, then I'll do some student exercises, and then I'll open it up for questions.
And just know there might be trick questions.
And I always like trick questions. Whenever I can think of a trick question, I'm going to slip it in. because the life of estimators is really one trick question after another. Because the actual project people that are bringing you estimation work often do everything they can, it seems like, to obscure the truth or to lead you down the wrong path.
Yeah, not intentionally, but they just, maybe you use the wrong terms for things or what have you.
Exactly. So if no one has any other questions, I guess I will see you on Friday.
All right.
Thanks, William.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.